The auditorium smelled like fresh paper and cheap perfume, that familiar mix of excitement and exhaustion that always comes with graduation day. I remember holding my cap in both hands, tracing my fingers along the edge, and pretending not to look at the empty seats in the audience. Rows and rows of families cheering, clapping, waving flowers, and one seat that should have been filled for me. But it wasn't. I'd told myself all morning not to care. But when you walk across a stage, hearing everyone else's name followed by laughter, applause, and cameras flashing, and yours is met with silence, it hits different. It doesn't just sting, it settles inside you like ice. After the ceremony, I walked out with my diploma in one hand and my phone in the other. That's when I saw the post that changed everything. It was my sister, Valerie, standing in front of the airport gates with my parents. Matching luggage, balloons, hashtag family trip to Italy. Underneath, my mom had commented, "She's the only one who makes us proud." The only one. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that line, but I remember every detail, the way my stomach turned, how my fingers trembled as I scrolled through the comments, people congratulating her, saying what a beautiful family we had, how lucky she was. Lucky. I laughed out loud. I don't even know why. Maybe because the word lucky never once belonged to me. I'd worked 2 part-time jobs through college. Valerie had my parents' credit card. I took the bus every morning at 6 a.m. She got a new car on her 18th birthday. And now, while I was standing alone with a piece of paper that cost me 4 years of sleepless nights, they were boarding a flight to Italy, celebrating the daughter they actually cared about. But that wasn't what broke me. It was realizing that I wasn't even angry anymore. I was done trying to make them proud, done chasing a place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. I remember whispering to myself, almost without thinking, "Fine, you can keep your trip, I'll keep my silence." And silence, I'd later learn, was the most dangerous weapon I had. You're watching her retaliation. If you're new here, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because sometimes revenge isn't about screaming. It's about smiling while they underestimate you. That night, I went home to the tiny apartment I shared with my roommate, Jenna. She was out celebrating with her boyfriend, so it was just me, a leftover cup of coffee, and the soft hum of my old laptop. I didn't plan on doing anything drastic. I just wanted to breathe. But when I opened my laptop, my fingers almost moved on their own. I logged into my parents' shared family account, the one I used to transfer my part of the rent whenever my dad helped with tuition. It was still connected to my name. I stared at the balance, $182,000. They'd been saving up for family projects. My father once joked it was for the good daughter's wedding. I guess that wasn't me. I didn't touch anything, not yet. I just looked, scrolled through the transactions, weekly charges from High, end stores, resorts, and consulting transfers, that I recognized as my father's side business, the one he'd always kept off his official records. He thought I didn't know, but I did. When you grow up invisible, you learn to notice everything. For the next few days, while they were posting selfies from Florence and sipping espresso in Rome, I started building something. A spreadsheet, a map, every account, every transfer, every little piece of data they thought no one cared about. I didn't know what my plan was yet. I just knew it was forming, quietly, like a storm building far out at sea. 2 weeks later, they came back. The house was full of laughter again, like nothing had ever happened. My mom bragged to neighbors about the family vacation, showing off pictures of Valerie in designer sunglasses. My dad poured himself whiskey and complained about jet lag. When I stopped by to return a box of old books I'd left behind, Valerie opened the door. She didn't even look surprised to see me, just annoyed. "Oh," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're here. Guess you finally graduated." "Yeah," I said, smiling politely. "Good for you. Maybe now you can get a real job." Her tone wasn't cruel, it was worse. Casual, like every word came from habit. I just nodded and stepped past her into the house. My mother was in the kitchen on a call. My father didn't even glance up from his paper. Same as always. They asked me how graduation went out of courtesy, not care. I gave short answers, smiled when expected, and left after 15 minutes. But something had changed. I wasn't that quiet daughter anymore. I was the girl who had access to everything. That night, I backed up all the financial records onto a drive. Then I did something small, something harmless at first. I moved $2,000 from their family fund into my savings, a test. No one noticed, so I tried again. $5,000 this time. Then $10,000. Still nothing. They were too busy planning Valerie's engagement party. By the end of the month, I had more than $40,000 quietly sitting under my name. It wasn't theft. It was repayment for 4 years of being the forgotten daughter. For every time I covered my own tuition, my own meals, my own rent, while they funded my sister's vacations. But I wasn't done, not yet. I wanted something more than money. I wanted balance. So I started digging deeper into my father's offshore accounts, the ones listed under shell companies. I used the same password he'd used since I was 12. He thought I'd never remember. I did, and what I found was bigger than I imagined: hidden transfers, tax evasion, fake consulting firms. He'd built a quiet empire under the radar, and it was all linked to the family account. That's when my plan finally took shape. Not revenge through anger, not exposure through scandal, but through precision. If they thought I was invisible, then fine, I'd use that invisibility to erase myself from their system and take every piece of their empire with me. The next few weeks were spent planning. Every morning, I worked my new part-time finance job. Every night, I built my blueprint, a sequence of transfers, timed withdrawals, and document backups. I wasn't just stealing. I was rewriting the balance of power. And when I finally pressed withdraw, for the first major transfer, I didn't feel guilt. I felt freedom, but this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the storm. The first withdrawals were almost anticlimactic. I had pictured fireworks shouting the sudden realization on their faces, but life, even dramatic life, rarely gives you that perfect moment. Instead, it gave me quiet, a transfer history that updated, an extra zero on my account, and the soft, ordinary hum of my roommate's Netflix show from the next room. I closed my laptop, breathed, and did the only small, sane thing left to do. I made myself a cup of tea and pretended I had not just rearranged the axis of my parents' world. For the next week, I tested the boundaries, moving modest sums, rerouting payments from the family card to a micro account I'd set up under a consulting alias, paying vendors I knew were owed by their shell companies, but whose invoices never saw the light because my father handled things personally. It felt like playing a long, private game of chess where every pawn I nudged revealed a little more of the board. Some nights I slept badly, other nights I could not stop smiling. The moral calculus didn't feel like theft when I thought about the tuition payments I'd covered, the unpaid overtime shifts that taught me balance sheet basics, the nights my rumbling stomach drowned out the muffled laughter of their dinner parties. I'd learned to keep receipts. That habit saved me now. Word traveled through the family like a cold draft through an open window. At first, my mother's calls arrived thick with pretense. "Honey, did you get my message? Come by Sunday." The Sunday, they planned to host a brunch to show off a new family investment, an art piece my father had acquired. Through a front was interrupted when the gallery called and said the transfer had been declined. The curator's voice, polite and slow, carried a kind of embarrassment that my mother tried to swallow down into a laugh and failed. She called my father into their office with the same nervous cadence of a person who keeps secrets that choke. Later that week, during a phone conversation that began with faux concern, my father's voice split between anger and disbelief. "There's something wrong with the account," he said. "I don't understand. Did you touch anything?" I said nothing. In the silence, my absence became a thing that probed, an itch they could not soothe by charm or blame. Without a blare of accusation, the house's insurance checks bounced, an autopay for a villa service failed, and small, humiliating emails began to accumulate in my mother's inbox. Payment incomplete, access blocked. They were too busy composing a narrative of denial to pay attention to the slow drip that would become a flood. The beauty of financial pressure is that it rarely looks like vengeance at the moment it begins. Collections agencies sent polite inquiries, vendors posted late notices, an accountant who had always allowed my father creative then entries, called with a voice that told me he'd watched a red column inflate. I kept my hands off the big accounts at first, because I didn't want the story to read like theft. I wanted it to read like consequence. My moves were surgical. Divert a scheduled payment to cover an old invoice from a contractor the family had stiffed 5 years earlier. Authorize a small direct debit to a local shelter in my grandmother's name that had never received anything. Freeze a corporate expense card that had paid for one of my sister's branded photo shoots, little things that rendered their lifestyle harder without making me the villain in anyone's script. It was ruthless and efficient, and there were nights I caught myself watching the news for any mention of a Quinn malfunction, as if it were weather. They tried to fix the noise with optics. My mother paid for a glossy piece in the lifestyle magazine, with a photograph of the Smiling Clan at a charity gala. They gave interviews where my father parroted carefully polished lines about family values and the importance of supporting their children. But the money footprint is a stubborn thing. Public relations cannot make unpaid invoices disappear. The first real crack, the one that woke the neighborhood and made the town's small talk change tone, came when Jessica's second sponsorship dropped a week before an event. A brand pulled out, citing unexpected financial complications. The influencer posts that used to fund their vacations went dark in a way that looked deliberate and expensive. People who'd once admired the Quinns began to tilt their heads and ask questions. That tilt, once it appears, is an animal's warning. Predators smell weakness and start to circle. In the background, as their world shifted, I amplified the pressure in a way I had not yet told myself I would. I reached out to a contact I'd made during college, an old professor who had become an investigative reporter. Her name was Layla, fiercely smart and bored of polite features. I didn't send a full dossier, I didn't need to. I fed her breadcrumbs, a notarized copy of a shell, company registration under a name that matched one of my father's aliases, a redacted invoice showing payments diverted through a charity account, copies of emails where my mother had asked a business manager to clear certain donations. I let Layla do the thing newspapers do best, connect the dots and publish the pattern. The headline that ran the following Thursday read like a small execution. Local family's luxury life under scrutiny, sheets of transactions raise questions. My phone filled up with texts from friends, strangers, even old schoolmates. My mother called in a voice that had lost its veneer. "Tessa, this is going too far." This was not so much my action as the mirror I had held up to their face. They didn't like the person they saw. The most painful part was how quickly my sister turned from co-conspirator to casualty. She had grown into the family image with a hungry ease, the right school, the right boyfriend, the right smile for photographs. But the image had depended on a well-oiled machine. When the machine began to stutter, she was the first to fall. I had never wanted to ruin her. She was, after all, still a woman scrambling under the rubble of the environment that made her what she was. But the machine didn't care for nuance. When the sponsors withdrew and the villa's maintenance account showed an overdue notice, she called me one night in full panic. "Tess, please can you help? Dad says there's been a mistake." Her voice sounded small, a voice I had heard when we were children and she'd broken a doll. For a moment my old, tender self wanted to step forward, pay a beleaguered bill, patch the hole. But my memory flashed. The times she'd waved past my graduation photos on her social feed. The casual cruelty of "she's lucky" comments. I remembered the long accumulation of small dismissals, so I did nothing. I let her feel the consequences as everyone else did. Letting her fall was its own kind of lesson. The world had always taught me lessons by omission. I let her learn, of course. This slow erosion required cover because you cannot simultaneously be invisible and omnipotent. I expanded my web by rebooting a consulting persona I'd created during a class project, Rowan Advisory. It was believable because it was small and precise, and in a town the size of ours, plausible little firms exist in the gaps where people trust their acquaintances. Through Rowan Advisory, I booked a series of microtransfers, paying a seized contractor, facilitating a charity update that required immediate clarification, discreetly underwriting a legal retainer for one of my father's vendors in exchange for documents about recent transactions. I had learned something practical in economics class that day. Cash is a language. If you can direct it, you can command stories. Each small payment had a narrative justification, and each narrative left a paper trail that made future audits easier for my side of the ledger. I built legitimacy like an artist builds a frame. They began to suspect a ghost. My father's paranoia was a slow-rolling storm. He called me once, voice measured and brittle, to ask benign questions that were anything but benign. "Tess, sweetie, my accountant says there are discrepancies. Do you know anything?" I could have lied. I could have said no, that I loved them, that the family account was a sacred thing. Instead, I answered with the truth that felt sweetest. I haven't touched anything I don't absolutely need. The pause that followed tasted like success. They flailed in their habitual way, blaming one another, shredding records, creating explanations that required expertise and patience neither of them had. My father started calling his business partners, trying to shore up loans and jerry-rig reputations. When a bank requested credentials for a recent wire, he fumbled for them in a fashion that made the bank official's tone grow clinical. When money becomes the story and you have no honest accounting, every conversation turns into a confession. Then the legal letters started to arrive, threats of litigation, requests for audits. The first subpoena landed at the house with a gentleman from a firm that smelled of stale leather. My mother broke down in the kitchen that night, sobbing into a dish towel as if the cloth could hold back the embarrassment. "What have you done?" She wailed into the phone the first time my silence became unbearable. "We raised you." There was an old cruelty in that sentence, a currency of righteousness they thought was never exchangeable. I had been raised, yes, but not loved. I said nothing. I had dinner with Jenna that night and watched a silly cooking show, the absurdity of domestic normality ringing like a bell in my ears. Outside, their cars sat like heavy sentries on the street they thought immortal. Now they were vulnerable, mortal human. As the pressure mounted publicly, I prepared the final phase. A financial implosion sometimes needs a match, but more often it needs a chronicle. I began to package the record I had: invoices, emails, bank statements, proof of transfers between shell entities and their personal accounts. There were enough signatures on enough documents to create a pattern that an investigator could not ignore. But I was careful. I anonymized a path first, feeding select pieces to Layla, the reporter, and to a firm that specialized in forensic accounting. I did not want chaos. I wanted a cleanup that revealed cause. The first expose hit midweek with an angle I'd helped frame corporate malfeasance disguised as family philanthropy. The tone was incisive, read like a doctor's report, meticulous, damning, unemotional. The public reaction was a slow rolling earthquake. Sponsors ended partnerships. Donations froze. Clients withdrew accounts. My parents' social circle narrowed to a handful of people who could not yet reconcile what they had believed with what the records demanded. It is complicated, the way shame operates. It doesn't collapse a person into one shape. It fractures them, releases old parts. My mother became furtive and listless, the one at social gatherings that nurses the wine glass like a talisman. My father transformed into a man who typed in 3A, M, and paced until the sun rose, and my sister, she stopped posting selfies as if something in her finger had gone numb. When we did speak, it was like touching a raw nerve. Our calls were quick, brittle negotiations where every word had an edge. Eventually, she sent a voice message. "Tess, I don't know how to fix this. Please." Her voice trembled in a way that made me remember a younger version of us, playing with a plastic tea set in a backyard that smelled of cut grass. I listened without replying, felt a tidal churn of sorrow and survival. Letting her fall had not made me cruel. It had made me whole, but my sense of wholeness was a cold one. There would be no embrace, the record needed no reconciliation. Then came the legal hearing that changed everything. An auditor from the state arrived with a team, a stack of subpoenas, and a calm expression. They wanted to see ledgers, contracts, all the back, and fourths my father had believed secret. My mother's face when the auditor thumbed through a file and said, "These transfers don't correspond to any declared income," was a portrait of collapsed myth. The bank froze accounts pending review. My father tried to blame clerical errors, a common defense, but paper rarely lies under pressure. Witnesses were contacted. Suppliers were asked uncomfortable questions. One by one, people who had once accepted the spread of money and favors began to tell the truth in depositions. The machine had been well engineered, but what I had learned in the smallest, loneliest hours, the attention to a name on a file. The way invoices stack like bones meant the difference between fiction and forensic reality. It had taken me a while to learn how to be that precise. My education had not come from textbooks alone, but from a life of observation. I'd watched the way my mother deflected when cornered, the way my father layered lies with compliments to make them feel like gifts, the way Jessica performed at charity galas to cover for nights of emptiness. I had learned each of their moves like a player studies an opponent, and then I had turned those moves against them. Deploying my evidence felt less like revenge and more like setting the world right. There is a moral vein in many people that waits for the right pressure. You just need to know where and how to press. Even with the audit in motion, the family made one last amateur attempt to salvage dignity through optics. They arranged a staged interview with a local morning show where my father would speak softly about family values and the pain of public scrutiny. The producer called and offered to tone down questions. My mother practiced a smile. My sister rehearsed a statement about misunderstanding. I watched the footage of their preparation from the studio feed I'd hacked as a test. They thought of me as a casual irritant, not an orchestrator. They did not know I'd already set a second net. I had arranged for one of the suppliers, the one who had once been stiffed and had a ledger with a conspicuous note payment by Quinn family account, to go on record first thing. The morning studio cut from the promotional clip to the live segment, and the supplier's testimony aired in the same block, concise and humiliating. The anchors were gentle but precise. Viewers saw timelines intercut with my father's own signature on invoices. They saw before and After photos of properties linked to shell companies, vanity evaporated. For a family that had hollowed themselves out into perfect images, the collapse was thunderous. I did not watch them fall. I had moved on. There is a strange economy to anger. It uses you up quickly, and I had seen enough of my life burned by other people's performances. Instead, I spent my time setting up the last piece restitution. Money does not erase pain, but it can offer a foundation. I hired a lawyer and an accountant of my own, and arranged for creditor settlements, payments to the suppliers who had been left waiting for years, and a small charitable fund in my grandmother's name for women returning to education. I wanted a ripple of something good to follow the chaos I had caused. It would not undo the years I had absorbed. No transfer could buy back innocence. But it would make sure the community that had enabled their pedestal would be less willing to build another. The climax came quietly, in a courtroom that smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. My parents stood thin and pale beneath the harsh lights, a cluster in the gallery who had once seemed imposing in their living room, but now looked like guests at a funeral they had organized for themselves. The judge read from pages and from ledgers I had furnished. My father attempted excuses that sounded small and obvious in the bright room. My mother wept silently at his side. The public defender whispered things that had the polite ring of emergency but little chance. At the end of a long afternoon, with a stack of rulings visible on the bench, the judge ordered a freeze of family assets and a review of tax liabilities. My parents' company faced penalties, fines, and the gnawing public humiliation that attends financial malfeasance. I sat in the gallery with my hands folded, feeling nothing like triumph. The verdict was legal, not moral, and it left open the harder work of living. Afterwards, in the cold light of late winter, my father came to the small coffee shop where I had taken refuge more than once. He had the broken look of a man who could not understand why he had been architect and victim in the same design. He sat down opposite me with his palms splayed on the table, as if trying to catch something that would not stay. "Tess," he said, voice raw, "we made mistakes." He said it like an inventory rather than apology. "We thought we were protecting you. We never meant to harm you." I looked at the lines around his eyes and felt the complicated tangle of resentment and grief. I thought of the years I'd given them the benefit of the doubt. Protecting, in their terms, meant hiding me. It meant rewriting destiny to suit their appetites. I told him so. We sat there for a long time without speaking much. I thought of my mother, a woman who had learned to wear affection as a costume. I thought of my sister, who had been raised to be an image and then taught to believe the image over the heart. My father reached for my hand as if salve could be applied in a single gesture. I did not pull away. I did not take his hand either. The world had shifted into a new geometry. Repair, when it comes, is patient. I had not orchestrated this to see them collapse and burn. I had done it to remove the scaffolding that made such performances possible. If any reconciliation would happen, it would be slow and with rules. Months later, after fines were settled, creditors paid, and the public's appetite for gossip moved on to a newer scandal, I began to take pieces of myself back. I rented an office briefly, hired a woman from the supplier list as a consultant, and launched a small venture that offered bookkeeping help and financial training to women who had been economically sidelined. It was honest, a far cry from family grandeur. It was also my way of building something that had roots and utility instead of glitter and debt. The petty satisfaction, the knowledge that my family's mansion had been purchased from their fraudulent accounts and was now under legal injunction, sat in my mind like a cold proof, but it no longer warmed me. Instead, I spent my energy trying to create opportunity for others, teaching women how to read a ledger so another woman would not be surprised when she found her life had been moved like property. There were nights when the old hurt rose up like a tide. A photo would appear of my sister holding a birthday cake looking fragile, or a neighbor would stop me and say, "I am so sorry, we had no idea." These apologies felt small next to the years of absence. But something else had shifted. People began to ask me for advice about their bills, to tell me stories of mismanaged funds and stolen trust. I sat with them, opened accounts, taught them to demand paper trails. Small acts, quiet work. It fixed things in the immediate and it recalibrated the town. In time, I saw my father working at the local community center, not as a pillar but as someone building trust that had to be earned. My mother volunteered in a kitchen behind a curtain of shame, but with steady hands. My sister moved away for a year, worked in a different city, and returned with a new humility that was not performative but grown from living. On a gray morning, a year after the first article appeared, I walked into the city office where my small business had its modest headquarters and sat at my desk. A courier left an envelope for me. Inside was a short note in a familiar hand. "I am proud, M." It was the same initial that had been on my grandmother's locket, the same one I'd carried for years. The letter's silence said more than any of their words had. I framed it and placed it on a shelf next to the first ledger I had ever balanced on my own. The world had not been entirely kind or merciful. The justice given to me had been a humankind slow, imperfect, and necessary. In the end, what I learned wasn't how to break people, but how to build a life that was indisputable. I could have spent decades in the roar of retaliation, making headlines and collecting trophies of ruin. Instead, I turned away from the spectacle and toward the practical: audits, training programs, small loans, and the occasional quiet refusal to forgive without accountability. I learned to let history be history, to let shame do its work and then get busy doing mine. Sometimes late at night, when the city hushes and the lights look like a beaded shawl across the skyline, I stand by my window and remember the graduation stage, the empty seats, the Instagram post that started it all. I remember how small I felt and how that smallness became a lens through which I practiced detail and discipline. I remember the taste of a cup of tea after a successful transfer, the tiny domestic triumphs that meant more than any vacation. I think of the people who lost their illusions that the Quinns were untouchable, and of the vendors who finally got paid and were able to feed their families a little easier. If anyone asks whether I enjoyed it, I will tell them no and yes at once. No, because watching people you once wanted to love unravel is a bitter spectacle. Yes, because truth is a cruel but honest melody, and when orchestrated carefully, it can render justice without the vulgarity of vengeance. I taught my sister humans, Gail dignity. I taught my parents that theft can look like benevolence until someone with attention and patience reads the paper. I built programs that taught women to read their bank statements. I sat with neighbors learning how to ask for receipts. That was my victory, not the headlines or court filings, but the slow rebuild where the community learned a better grammar for rights. Sometimes I run into my mother by accident in the grocery store's produce aisle. There's a softness now when she lifts her eyes to me that never used to be there. She buys fewer luxury items, and sometimes she brings me vegetables she can't cook. We nod like people who have lived through a storm and keep watch for each other now. Perhaps that's the most merciful thing of all, not a fairy tale of forgiveness, but a practical, finite peace. It is steady, predictable, true. On a late spring afternoon, I walked past the Quinns' old villa. The hedges were trimmed, the paint fresh, but there was a stillness to the place that hadn't been there before domestic caution. My sister passed by with a bag of groceries. She gave me a small half-smile and moved on. I felt neither gloat nor relief. I felt finally ordinary. I had my ledgers, my small staff, my programs, my life. That was enough. I had learned the cost of invisibility, and then invested that knowledge into making sure no one else would have to learn the lesson the way I did. That, in the quiet ledger of living, balanced the books. If you ask me whether I missed them, I will answer honestly. Yes, sometimes I missed the version of family I had wanted, but I no longer wanted the version they offered. I wanted a family that kept its receipts and its promises. I wanted a life where I could say my name and have it mean something other than waiting. I wanted the dignity of a woman who kept accounts. I wanted a room that held me without sparing me the hard work. I wanted to be loud in ways that mattered. So if you take anything from this, let it be this: vigilance is not bitterness. Learning how to read a ledger is not vindictiveness, it is survival. The quiet work of watching, recording, and redirecting can be the fiercest kindness to yourself. The truth once accounted for is louder than a scream. The money I moved back into my own life did more than purchase things. It bought me time, options, and the calm to build something that would never depend on another's performance. The fire that burned their image left behind the ash of knowledge, and from that ash I planted new things. And when the night is still and the city is a smear of gold, I sometimes speak their names without anger, the way one might call weather, mother, father, sister. It's an inventory, an accounting, and a farewell. Then I close the ledger, walk to the window, and rest. The work continues small, slow, steady, but for the first time in my life, I do it from a place of choice. The morning my father called me, his voice didn't sound like the man I grew up fearing. It was quieter, brittle, like the confidence that once filled every word of his had been replaced by something fragile. "Panic, Tessa," he said, his breath uneven. "We need to talk, now." I was at my new office, the finance firm I'd started working for 2 months earlier. I looked out through the glass walls as the city buzzed below me. I could almost picture him pacing his marble kitchen floor, holding his phone in one hand, a half-empty glass of whiskey in the other. What's wrong? I asked, though I already knew. It's the accounts, he said. Something's wrong. We've lost control of the funds. The system's locked. Transfers are frozen, even the offshore. I let silence fill the line just long enough for him to hear the faint sound of my keyboard clicking. Then I said softly, "That's strange. You always told me your system was foolproof." He didn't answer at first. I heard a faint exhale more like disbelief than breath. "Tessa," he finally said, "what did you do?" For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered every ignored birthday, every sarcastic comment about how I'd never amount to anything. And suddenly, the pity vanished. "I did what you always taught me to," I said. I paid attention. He started to say something else, but I hung up before he could. I sat there for a long minute, watching the reflection of the city lights dance across my desk. Then I opened my screen again. The final transfer had cleared that morning. $182,000. The family fund was now distributed into 5 different accounts I controlled under separate entities. The rest is shell company records, the tax fraud proofs, the fake consulting invoices were sitting safely in a cloud backup, scheduled to be sent automatically to federal investigators in 72 hours. That part wasn't for money, that was for closure. When you've been invisible your whole life, there's something poetic about watching the people who made you feel small realize you were always the one watching them. That evening, I stopped by their house one last time. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that lives in a place after a storm. Boxes were stacked near the door. The family that once flaunted luxury was now preparing to sell the house to pay off unexpected debts. Valerie was in the living room, her perfect hair undone, scrolling furiously through her phone. "This is all your fault," she hissed when she saw me. "You think you're so clever, but you've ruined everything." I looked around at the marble floors, the framed vacations, the remnants of the world they'd built on lies. "No, Val," I said softly. "I just stopped letting you ruin me." She glared, eyes burning, but said nothing more. My father came downstairs. He looked older not in the way people age over years, but in the way guilt can steal time from a face overnight. He didn't yell this time, didn't demand. He just looked at me like he finally saw me. "You could have come to me," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." I met his eyes. I did. I said, "Because you never would have listened otherwise." He didn't follow me when I turned to leave. He didn't even call my name. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of rain again, the same as the night I graduated. But this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt cleansing. As I walked away from that house, my phone buzzed a notification from the scheduled release system confirming that the files had been uploaded to the investigators. Within hours, their empire would crumble publicly, and I wouldn't have to lift another finger. I didn't look back. 2 months later, I moved to Chicago, a new apartment, a new name on the office door, Rowan Financial Strategies. I built my own consultancy, quietly advising small businesses women who'd been underestimated, underpaid, overlooked. People like me. Every morning I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the sunrise over the skyline. No drama, no guilt, just peace, the kind that only comes when you've rewritten your own ending. My parents still tried to contact me a few times, emails filled with apologies, excuses, and regret. I never replied. Some things don't need closure. Some things are better left as silence. One evening, I got a message from Valerie. It was short, just one line. "You really destroyed us, didn't you?" I typed back, "No, Val, you destroyed yourselves. I just stopped pretending it didn't hurt." Then I deleted her number. That night, I finally smiled, not out of triumph, but peace. I'd spent my whole life thinking I had to earn love. Turns out I only needed to earn freedom. And as I turned off the lights and looked out at the city that once felt so far away, I whispered to myself, "They said she's the only one who makes us proud. Now I'm the only one who made it out."